As I was volunteering as a guide there for a while, they had me posted in the old train station, and sometimes a Conrail train would come lumbering by at about 5 miles an hour, closer, closer, closer. And everybody who was in the train station looking at the exhibits would run out the door and look at that train. And everybody would ask me, like, well, what railroad was this? And I finally looked it up and realized it was part of the old Reading system. But as I got more and more into history and did more research, I began to realize the vast importance of railroads in the expansion of America in the 19th century. And you can kind of see that reflected on the Eastern Shore, because the Eastern Shore was kind of bypassed by railroads for a long time. And but folks who lived down here dearly wanted railroads. Like as early as 1833, that was the earliest plan that I found for a chartered railroad in the state of Maryland, which would have run from Elkton down to Tangier Sound, close to where Crisfield is today. And that was unfortunately, that was one of the many, many railroads of the 19th century that was chartered and then never built. It would have been called the Eastern Shore Railroad. It would have been the first of 3 railroads to actually bear that name. But that's like 1833. And even earlier than that, there was an attempt to cross the Delmarva Peninsula with a very short railroad, very short line, called the Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad. Now, Newcastle is still there today, but you'd need to be an archaeologist to ever find Frenchtown, which would have been on the, on the Elk River, actually. And then steamship lines, called the Union Lines of Steamship, would have joined these and extended the reach to Philadelphia and Baltimore. So anyway, in the late 1820s, you get railroads going across the Delmarva. You get plans for railroads running north and south. Back down in Virginia, in the 1850s, there were also plans for 2 railroads running north and south. Neither one of them got built either. Over in Delaware, they had a little bit more success. I believe in 1836 was chartered the Delaware Railroad, which then languished for a long time because in 1837 there was what they used to call a financial panic or a crash, a depression. So for a long time, nothing was done about this other chartered railroad that wasn't built, until along came another railroad who kind of adopted them and got them built, sort of sponsored them. And that was called the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad. Now, if you've ridden Amtrak today between Philadelphia and Baltimore, you have pretty much gone over this route. And that was also established in the 1830s. It was doing very well. And they could see to their own advantage the idea of having a railroad that ran north and south through Delaware. Now, the original plans were to extend that railroad through Maryland, through Virginia, to a steamboat landing that was called Cherrystone Landing in Virginia. There still is a Cherrystone in Virginia, but there's no more steamships pulling up in there. So anyway, that was an attempt, and it wasn't until the 1850s that the Delaware Railroad gets built. But even while the Delaware Railroad is still being built and people can see that they're laying tracks, they're laying rails, there's really going to be a railroad, other communities on the Eastern Shore began thinking, well, that's going to be like a north-south spine. We can join up to that. We can join our towns up to that railroad. And then we also get transportation north onto the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad to Philadelphia, to Baltimore, to Wilmington, wherever we want to send our produce. So that spawned what I call the little feeder empire, the Delaware Railroad's feeder empire of east-west feeders, little lines. So that long intended goal of reaching down north to south all the way along the Delmarva Peninsula is suddenly within the reach of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the well-funded, well-built Pennsylvania Railroad. And they begin to do what they do very well, which is kind of take over other railroads. The Pennsylvania Railroad had been founded originally to run from the Susquehanna River westward into Pittsburgh, to create one continuous railroad. They do that, and then they buy from the state of Pennsylvania what was called the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad, which then gave them tracks stretching all the way across Pennsylvania. Around the time of the Civil War, they begin eating up other railroads, at first in central Pennsylvania, and then following the Civil War, that's their big expansion period, where they acquire other railroads that give them access to Chicago, to Cincinnati, to St. Louis, across New Jersey to New York. So why not down the Delmarva Peninsula and join up to Norfolk with like a rail water transportation system. Now the well-known story, or the story that everybody who lives down here thinks they know, is that there were two entrepreneurs, one of them named Alexander Cassatt. If you live in Pennsylvania, especially the Philadelphia area, that's a very well-known name. And the other one was William L. Scott. And the story is that they approached the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad with this idea that they were going to build this railroad down through Maryland and into Virginia. And then they would do something revolutionary, which would be take the loaded boxcars, load them onto car floats, or I should say railroad ferries, you know, that sort of thing, and just ship them across the Chesapeake Bay to Norfolk, Virginia. And this was supposed to be like a very revolutionary plan. Only the Pennsylvania Railroad said, no, we're not interested. And so these two entrepreneurs went off on their own and built the New York, Philadelphia, and Norfolk Railroad. Yeah, that's kind of true, but it wasn't a new idea at the time. It had been around since 1833. Also, the idea of the car floats, of loading boxcars onto barges, essentially, wasn't exactly new either. That's something that had been developed during the Civil War by a fellow named Herman Haupt, who was, big surprise, an engineer for the Pennsylvania Railroad. So it had already been in use. But anyway, it was the revolutionary part of the idea would be shipping those boxcars over open water as opposed to over a harbor or a river or something, you know, much smaller body of water. So anyway, what happens in the well-known story is they get together and they build this railroad and everything is great. Actually, what happened, I think, is that the Pennsylvania Railroad was always behind this idea, but never wanted to make it never wanted to make it obviously a branch of the Pennsylvania Railroad. One thing that I wanted to mention about those early railroads, the little feeder system. This is Okay, this is just a systems map for an existing railroad, a modern railroad called the Delmarva Central Railroad. And they are the operator now for Norfolk Southern, which runs what used to be the Delaware Railroad, going straight down here as far south as Hallwood in Virginia. Now, if you look at what the Maryland and Delaware Railroad are operating here, they're coming from a interchange in Townsend to Wharton and to Centerville. Now, the old line to Wharton used to go all the way down to Chestertown, and it was called the Kent County Railroad at the time. And that's another creature of the 1850s that's chartered then. I believe it's finally built a number of years later. The line that goes down here to Centerville was the Kent and Queen Anne and Kent, or Kent and Queen Anne, whatever. It was another one of those little feeder railroads. There was another one that used to go from, well, this is roughly Easton, and this is roughly, I can't even say it now. But anyway, went roughly from Clayton to Easton. That was the original Maryland and Delaware Railroad. That was like shut down, that no longer exists, but there's a bit of a rail trail in Easton where that railroad used to run. And then down here, this little line that goes down here was part of the eastward extension of a feeder off of the Delaware Railroad, which was called the Junction and Breakwater Railroad. And you notice it does a little jog around Milford. The people in Milford had been very annoyed that the Delaware Railroad bypassed their town. So this east feeder was extended down through Milford, first to Lewis, and then to Frankfort a little bit later, and then finally further south to Franklin City, which finally gave it access to Chincoteague. So anyway, I find it interesting that some of those 1850 railroads are still in operation today.